In this video, we're going to get into some of the more advanced pivot table features. Hopefully you've had some time to play around with the things that we learned in our previous pivot table videos. The best way for you to get comfortable using pivot tables is to use pivot tables. Problem solve, struggle through the challenges, and learn how they function. Today we'll be using pretty much the same data set that we had previously, except this time we've added some columns here for the amount of money that a customer has spent in the past month and the quantity of things that they've purchased in that same time frame. This will allow us to do some calculations within the pivot table. To get started, again, I'm going to recommend that we use a named range. So we'll select our entire data set and we'll name this, I'm going to say data 2. This, using a named range, again, allows us to add or remove rows or columns depending on how our data changes over time. We'll add a new sheet here. And we'll choose Insert, Pivot Table, equals Data 2. We'll press OK, leave the rest of the values as their defaults. And here we now have a pivot table. And again, over to the side in our pivot table field list, we're able to see all of those columns and all of the different boxes to move information. We can actually change how this is laid out, and your computer may be defaulted to a different view. If you want to change that, you just press this settings icon here. The first question that we're going to attempt to answer looks back to some of the work that we did last time. So we'll start by setting up first our type of preferred fishing method as a column, and then our store as a row. One of the settings that I like to change every time in this options menu is to uncheck this auto fit column widths. I prefer to keep the column widths what I set them to be rather than what the table sets them to be. We'd like to understand how many people prefer each of these methods. Now, last time what we showed is that we could add store here into the values field and it fills that table in to show us exactly how many. But these numbers don't make all the sense that we need them to make. We want to understand what percentage of people actually do this. So in our initial video, we went and calculated that percentage manually. In this video, I'm going to show you how pivot tables can do that for us. Down here in this values box, we can go to value field settings. And we've talked already about how you can summarize values by a number of different methods here. Today we'll look at this show values as option. And what this allows us to do is do some calculations. You can show it as a percent of the grand total, as a percent of the column total, the row total, and there are a number of different things that are on this list. Today we're going to focus mainly on these top three, but there are a lot of different things that you can do to show the data in a form that answers the different types of questions that you may come up with. We'll start by showing it as a percent of the grand total. And what that means is our grand total is 1,500. If we want each of these data points to show up as a percentage of that 1,500, then we will use this grand total calculation. When we choose number format here, we can also ask it to show it as a percentage, and I'll just choose to show 1 decimal place. We'll click OK, and we'll click OK again. And now you'll notice that these numbers have been changed from their initial count to showing the percentage. What this allows us to do is very quickly understand, here's 21.5% of people, which represents Lehigh and Spinners, of our total 100% of customers. Let's copy this pivot table down and look at this data a couple of different ways. We'll make 2 copies of it. And in the first copy here, we'll go to this values, value field settings, show values as, and this time we'll show them as a percentage of the column total. Click OK. And in this table, we'll switch them to a percentage of the row total. Click OK. And let's look at the differences in what these numbers give us. Here, all of these tie back to this bottom right corner here. You'll notice in this instance, for the column totals, they show total of 100% at the bottom of each column. And then these add up to that 100%. They're showing you here, for bait, the customer breakout across the 3 different stores. Think of this row totals here as the opposite view. If at Ammon, I want to understand how do the types of fishing methods break out across that one store, here's how I can see that. So depending on the question that you're trying to answer with the data, you may look at it different ways. If you want to understand from a total company perspective what's happening, this first table where you're showing it as a percentage of the grand total makes the most sense. If you were looking at it from a geographic standpoint to understand where your sales come from, You may want to look at this where it breaks out which stores tend to over-index in your particular category here. If you were at a store and you wanted to understand where your sales came from within that store, looking at this as a row total makes the most sense because now you can see what makes up your 100% here. So different audiences will need different views on the data, and pivot tables allow you to very quickly see those different views. The next thing I'd like to show you is how you can create charts using pivot tables. So if we take this first pivot table, we'll copy it and we'll paste it over here. And let's simplify a little bit of what the data is that we're showing. Let's say instead of showing all of the different types of fishing and the stores, let's just look at the gender across all of our stores, what percentage are male and what percentage are female. We can go on, and this works on any pivot table. You can go up here to the top and choose Pivot Table Analyze and choose right here, Pivot Chart. And when we do that, it gives us the same breakout here that we have when we insert a chart regularly. We'll choose a clustered column and we'll click OK. What's different about this particular chart is that instead of showcasing all of just the data, it actually has filters here as well. So I can change what's shown on the chart by using those filters. I can also change it if I add things to the pivot table. So if I wanted to add, for example, the type of fishing that's preferred by gender, I could add that here as a series. And now we can see across male and female what percentage of those go towards each of these three types of fishing. If instead of doing that, I wanted to include the store, I could add it here and it would now group those by each store to show you the percent of the grand total. Now, percent of grand total doesn't make sense if I have this broken out by store. So I may want to change this over here to show values as, instead of percent of grand total, I may want to show it as percent of column total. And if I do that, you'll see it still adds up to 100%. Nothing's really changed. The reason for that is I only had one column. So what we really want to do here is show these values as a percent of each of the stores so that I can see at each store what is the breakout of gender. In order to do that, I can choose percent of parent row total. When I click OK here, you'll notice now each of these adds up to 100% for this, and each of these stores adds up to 100% across the entire thing. So now I can see what percentage are male and female. And I might want to change this chart a little bit depending on how I want to view it. I'll press Control C, we'll make a copy of it, press Control V up here to paste it in. And now if I want to choose to change the chart type, I may want to do a bar chart instead. And when I click OK, you'll see that I now have one chart that shows it horizontally and the other chart that shows it vertically. And I can choose which one might show me my data better. I can also, on the chart, use these filters. So if I wanted to exclude Ammon, Idaho, I could show that right here and it would filter it across all of those different things. Now let's create a few more charts based on this data that we have. I'm going to move these out of the way over to the side and we'll go back to these three initial tables that we have. If I go up here and I choose to insert a pivot chart, I'll do a clustered column, and then I'll do that same thing for this next table, clustered column. And I'll move them over so you can see them. And then I'll do this final table here. Again, same type of thing. I'll click OK. And now I have three different charts based on my data here. I'm going to add a new sheet. We'll call it Dashboard. And we'll call this one Pivots. And on my dashboard sheet, which should always be at the beginning, in this particular workbook I have part 1 sheets from the first video and part 2 from this video. So I'll put the dashboard here at the beginning, but usually it's always the first sheet. And on this table here, I can select all of these holding the Control key, press Control X to cut, and over here press Control V to paste. Now what I'm able to do is very quickly showcase with all three of these charts so that we can see them what all of the data is. Now each of these, remember, had a different type of showing the values as. This one shows as a percent of column total. So I'll label this by going to Chart Element, Chart Title, choose Above Chart, and this I'll say percent of column total. Over here, when I go into this one, I click in Value Field Settings and I see this one is percent of grand total. So here I'll add that same chart title and I'll say percent of grand total. And on this final one, it's going to be the percent of row total. And now I have all three of these charts that I can show on the same sheet. If I turn off the grid lines on this sheet so that we keep it a little bit cleaner, I could add titles and touch it up. We won't go through dashboarding in this video, we've done that in another one. But we would want to label these charts to be a little bit more intuitive. Percent of column total doesn't make much sense. But if I understood it to be what the column was, in this case, the stores, I can understand where my business comes from. So the titles of these charts you may want to adjust to make sense to what they're actually showing. In this example video, I'm just showing you that you can create charts very quickly, and those charts can tie back to the pivot tables, which tie back to our raw data. And so that's one way to very quickly visualize data and showcase a number of different views on the same base data without having to create manually a bunch of different charts. Additionally, if you wanted to filter these, we could uncheck one of them here and make that action happen right on the dashboard without having to move around and go back and forth between the pivot tables and this sheet. Now, instead of filtering the data on each of these charts one at a time with these drop-downs, there's actually a way that you can filter all of the data across these pivot tables at the same time. That tool is called a slicer. It helps you to slice and dice the data. If we select this first chart here at the top, we can go to Pivot Chart Analyze, and here choose Insert Slicer. And we can choose which field do we want to have a slicer for. I'm going to start with gender. We click OK, and here we have a slicer that allows us to change and filter based on gender here. If I click on male, you'll see it change slightly. Click on female, it changes slightly, and if I remove the filter, it goes back to the way it was. Right now, this slicer is connected only to this chart. But because we share the same data source for all of these charts, I can connect this slicer to those other reports as well. Right here under Report Connections, I can choose to include a number of different things. On this sheet here, I can check off all of the pivot tables that exist, click OK, and now I can slice all at the same time with the click of a button. I can do it another way here by choosing to insert a slicer, and this time I want to slice by store, type of preferred fishing method. If I click OK here, it now has both of those slicers are in here, and I can align them up next to each other. I can choose to edit their report connections, and I'll add all of those pivot tables that we worked on the previous sheet. So now if I change any of these, you'll see it filters instantly all of the reports that it's connected to. So slicers are a very quick way to slice and dice data to be able to get to insights and narrow down your scope of research. You can also format slicers up here. You can choose the number of columns that they have. You can choose to show or hide this title here at the top. You can remove it. You can resize them and rearrange them on the page depending on what you want it to look like. So that's a quick introduction into slicers. And slicers can be combined so that we can filter more things at the same time or all things at once. We can also choose to use only one slicer in a given moment. Two more quick notes about slicers. If I wanted to select more than one item, I can hold down the Control key on my keyboard and select more than one item. The other thing that I can do to clean up a dashboard is, since these filters are no longer needed because I have them in a slicer, I can go up here to Pivot Chart Analyze, choose Field Buttons here, and then I can uncheck all of these, or I can just choose to hide all. And now it looks like a regular chart that you would use in Excel. If I do that for all of these reports here, I can quickly change the data that's shown on them just through the use of these slicers without having to go in and alter the settings in any other way. Slicers can be very handy as you're trying to understand what the data is telling you, and it makes it much easier for users on a dashboard to be able to manipulate your data as well. As is typical, we'd want to apply the standards of professionalism to make these charts look and feel the best that they can, but that is not the focus of this video. Instead, we're going to move on to the next thing, which is calculated fields within a pivot table. So to do that, let's open up a new sheet here, and we'll insert a pivot table. we'll use our same data source, equals data 2. We'll click enter. You'll notice here that we have this money spent and quantity purchased. If I put those in the values field down here at the bottom, you can see the sum of the money spent and the sum of the quantity purchased. If we format them correctly, we can go to value field settings, choose number format, we'll choose currency, and let's just do 0 decimal points. Click OK, and then here for sum of quantity purchased, we can also choose to change that to a number. We'll use the thousand separator, we'll click OK, and we'll click OK. This tells us that these customers self-reported that they spent a total of $150,000 across 16,000 different units. If we break that out by store here, we can see that our sales break out about the same way that our counts broke out in terms of their fishing preference. But what if we wanted to understand the average retail price that was being charged? Typically, we would take that sales amount here, we'd divide it by the quantity purchased, and then we might copy that formula down. Instead of doing that, we can actually make that calculation happen in the pivot table. Go to Pivot Table Analyze, choose Fields, Items, and Sets, and choose Calculated Field. We will name this average price, and we will use a formula which is the money that was spent divided by the quantity that was purchased. When we click OK, it adds that here. We can change the value field settings to show the number format as currency with 2 decimal places, and we'll click OK, and we'll click OK again. So what we can see is across all of these stores, customers on average spent $9.23 per item that they purchased. In Ammon, the spend was a little bit less, and in Lehi, the spend was a little bit more. We could further break that out by showing gender to see if there's a spend difference, and it looks like there is. Here, at least in Ammon, females spent significantly more than males per transaction. We could also break it out to see if it varies by the type of fishing preferred. I'm going to put that above gender, and I'm going to use this collapse field to see that, look at that, people that were buying spinners, at least in Ammon, were spending a lot more than were customers that were buying bait or flies. In Boise, those that were buying flies spent significantly more, while in Lehi, we can see that their spend is almost the same, bait being a little bit higher. If I wanted to drill into that to understand this spinner difference here, I could double click or press the plus up here, and I could see that a lot of that came from female shoppers that purchased significantly more per unit in terms of the price per unit that they spent. If we go back up to Fields, Items, and Sets, and we go to Calculated Field, you can see that we can actually use any of these fields that are there to do a formula calculation. Calculations happen at the row level, meaning that each of these, it would be the same as if I wrote each of these formulas on this particular row. It's dividing this amount here by this amount here. When you use calculated fields, you can have Excel list out those formulas, and it will show you in this case exactly that one formula that we've added, and it also tells you the solve order for it. So more complex calculations may have multiple steps, and they're dependent on former calculations. As we go through and use pivot tables more often, you'll find it's very helpful to use calculated fields to help you be able to figure out what the numbers are telling you. If you had columns for sales spent this year and last year, you could calculate a percent change and include that right in your pivot table. And then that way, as you drill up or drill down, you can include those insights along the way. Like the other Excel functions that we learn about, there are a lot more things that you can do with pivot tables, and they are very useful as you're putting together analysis or dashboards. The best thing that you can do is continue to practice and get experience using these pivot tables. If you run into an issue, remember the video from the beginning of the semester where we talked about how to search online using a search engine. People have made videos and walkthroughs for just about every feature that Excel has to offer. And so if you feel like there's something that you don't quite understand fully as a result of watching these videos on pivot tables so far, I encourage you to go take a moment and search online to find what people have shown. Additionally, there may be differences across operating systems between Windows and Macs, for example. Pivot tables are one of those features that you need to understand how to use to be successful using Excel. So please take the time necessary to practice and to study on it. And hopefully this proves to be one of the skills that you take with you as a result of learning this class into the other things that you do. Pivot tables will make your analysis much, much faster and much more customizable as you learn how to answer different types of questions.